Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron. They'll make their way there shortly, visiting the tomb. Richard Johnson, just want to ask you about this. When we look at these two leaders, it is a difficult time for each man because they have low approval ratings, and they each see a strong presence of the far right in their respective countries. How important is this visit for them?
I guess they're both in slightly different points in their own political cycles. Macron is not facing re-election. Of course, he wants to be able to hand on France to a successor who's of like mind and to mitigate against the threat of the far right as Joe Biden.
Richard, I'm sorry to cut you off again. We're going to listen in to the U.S. national anthem playing right now. Will be followed by France's national anthem. We just heard the U.S. national anthem followed by France's national anthem. Now we're expecting perhaps a color guard and a wreath laying. Richard, sorry to cut you off. Earlier you were discussing the pressure each leader is under in their respective countries.
And I think they're under slightly different pressure because Joe Biden, of course, is facing re-election this year in a way that Macron doesn't have to worry about anymore. And so although the nature of the challenges the two men are facing are similar, the kind of the personal pressure that they'd be facing from it is somewhat different. I think for Biden, this is not just about politics for him. This is something that he cares deeply about on a long-standing level. He was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's someone who's always believed in the United States playing a strong leadership role in the world. And I think while he can find leaders who agree with that, even if they don't always see eye to eye, he wants to stiffen those connections, those bonds. And I think he sees someone in Macron that he can work with, someone who basically perceives the challenges of the world in similar ways.
Just laying the wreath now at the tomb of the unknown soldier. We're going to watch these images and listen in.
Plus la 5 que la 3, plus la 5 que la 3. Présentez. Garde. Au mort. Disposé. Armes. Repos.
Stirring rendition of the U.S. and French national anthem by the choir of France's army. William Jordan, anytime France's military choir sings, I always find it very impressive. But really a testimony to the Transatlantic alliance here, also seeing this display of long-standing friendship between two countries.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's one thing the French are outstanding at, it's symbolism, and it's in marking these kinds of things. And I believe Joe Biden, just like a lot of Americans, certainly of his age and even up into my generation, are fully aware of just how, in terms of World Wars I and II, the French people are so grateful for America's participation in those wars, and especially from 1944 on, the liberation of France. And so these occasions always underscore just how deep, beyond what relationships there might be between governments and between leaders, but even among the peoples of the countries. So absolutely, I mean, this is what France does supremely well. And as you said, having or listening to the French Armed Forces Choir singing the American Star Spangled Banner in English is very moving.
Indeed. Richard, I promise I'm not going to cut you off this time. When we see, we discuss it every year with the commemorations that more and more veterans are passing away. And so ceremonies like this become more important to remember the lessons of the past. How much in danger are we of perhaps forgetting those lessons with the way the polarization, the political polarization is in all these countries right now in the West?
I think the memory of the Second World War was for a generation of people in Western Europe and North America and Australia, indeed around the world. It was a unifying memory, really. It was a war that became, or was indeed understood at the time, as a struggle for freedom. There was a clear sense of victory for the cause of freedom, that the international institutions that were set up after the war had a kind of symbolic legitimacy because they flowed out of that struggle against Nazism and fascism and Japanese imperialism. And for politicians who either served in that war or lived through that war, or had the memories of, say, their parents or grandparents in that war, I think that has been a very important memory. But the current, my students, for example, who were born in the 21st century, not only do they, of course, not have any of those memories, but they don't really know people in their own lives who themselves lived through that war. I mean, I had grandparents who fought in the war, and I can remember my connections with them. They don't really even have that connection. And so that way in which the Second World War brought together a kind of common understanding of what was required to fight for freedom in the world, I think is fading into the history books and won't have the same potency for this current generation. And Biden is a rare politician, I think, who is able to bridge and translate from that older generation to the one today. But the question is, will the next generation really understand the stakes of a world in which the United States, there is a question mark over U.S. leadership in the world moving forward?
Yeah, a lot of questions about U.S. leadership. This week we even heard Joe Biden telling Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky that he can count on his administration's support, that they wouldn't abandon Ukraine. William Jordan, of course, he qualified that as his administration because we don't know what's going to happen in November.
Exactly. Well, and before this administration reaches the end of this term, and we see who's sworn in on January 20, 2025, you still have a lot of reluctance in the American Congress, particularly in the House, dominated by Republicans, to consider seriously any further aid to Ukraine, and posing very real limits in terms of the ability of this administration to be able to do much in the international field. I mean, the current House, for example, just passed or is in the process of passing legislation that probably won't ultimately be adopted to slash the USAID budget, as well as other aspects of State Department and other foreign affairs agencies. So, yes, your emphasis on the administration is right. This administration keeps reaffirming its commitment to stay engaged, but that's not necessarily the priority of others in the political establishment in Washington.
And we also see at the same time U.S. influence abroad diminishing more and more.
And I think countries, especially here in Europe, waking up finally to that understanding that the United States is not necessarily a country they can count on in the way that they have for decades to provide the overall umbrella and insurance that they need in terms of their security. That's not necessarily a wrong message, but it's a late message, and it's a message that's being delivered in a very brutal way that has stark implications potentially for the future.
Yeah, I'm Kevin Gorgistani at the Élysée Palace. Kevin, one of Emmanuel Macron's main goals is to get a European defense initiative that's proven not just controversial across the other side of the Atlantic, but also within here in Europe, about Europe's role and its budget and how to allocate its resources.
Absolutely. He is one of the leaders of, or the proponents of that European defense. And I think it is largely in part to a reaction to what he's seen across the Atlantic, and the fact, as you were just talking about, which is that we don't know how long or whether the United States will still be part of this transatlantic alliance, and if not leaving it, simply questioning the role of the United States and the fact that you can no longer 100% count on that leadership of the Americans going forward. That is something that sort of was an electroshock to the Europeans. And I think Emmanuel Macron jumped on that to try to promote this idea that he had to point to what was going on in the United States, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Congress, to say we can count on the Americans, but we can't solely be counting on the Americans. We have to have our own defense. And the message from the United States is a little bit similar in the sense that they are saying that, yes, we want to be the leaders of the free world. We will continue, at least the Biden administration, to stand by Europe, but we cannot do it alone. They say it in the sense that, in the words of some members of the administration, this is not an arrogant leadership that thinks that it can do anything on its own, but it is a humble leadership that understands that they need Europe as much as Europe needs them. And so it has to be a sort of equal footing when it comes to that transatlantic defense. And I think in that sense, the Biden administration really sees something with Emmanuel Macron and his push for more European defense. Whatever that means within Europe is a different story. There are some countries that seem to align or agree, at least in principle, with that strategy of Emmanuel Macron. But getting to the European defense is much harder to get everyone to agree.
Yeah, Richard Johnson in London. How does Europe step out of America's shadow?
Well, I think it's a question of what Macron has called strategic autonomy. And what that really requires, I think, is for the European Union to make some important decisions about being able to coordinate much better and speaking on one voice on foreign affairs. That will take, I think, more integration. It will take the willingness of different European states to set aside some of their own national autonomy, I think, on foreign and domestic policy, in order for there to be stronger, unified, European-wide decision-making. I think that really is the way forward for Europe if it wants to take that position of strategic autonomy. The strategic autonomy is not saying that Europe needs to take a line against the United States. It's not about Europe being antagonistic to the United States, but it is what Macron himself acknowledged in a speech in April, that Europe is not the main priority for the United States. Yes, the United States is very concerned about what's going on in Ukraine, but really it's for the United States, it's the China challenge, and that is really what explains a lot of the domestic policy posture that Joe Biden has pursued, whether that was the Inflation Reduction Act, whether that was the CHIPS Act. And also looking at the arrangement, say, the AUKUS agreement between the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, right? That caused a lot of frustration with France that wanted to be able to deliver nuclear submarines to Australia. And I think those differences underline for Macron and some other European politicians the importance of Europe stand on its own 2 feet. Because if this is the difficulties they're facing when they have a friendly figure in the White House under Joe Biden, then where are they going to be? What would happen if they had a much more antagonistic administration in a few months' time?
Yes, Richard. William Jordan would like to respond.
I actually want to reinforce a lot of what Richard and Katavan have said by saying that, by adding the point that I think that, as we talk about the reckoning that's happening in the United States politically in terms of the upcoming presidential and congressional elections, Europe is facing its own reckoning. It has been facing its own reckoning since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Europe is demonstrating the lack of unity, of vision in approach to all of this. We're going to see a lot of this play out during the European parliamentary elections tomorrow, but these wide divergences are going to, I think, throw a lot of things in the air as far as what kind of a Europe there is going forward as a unified whole, whether you need to reconsider the idea of going together as a bloc, either the NATO members, the European NATO members, or the European Union. I think it's going to need to go back to a community of like-minded nations to be able to find some common ground. The differences between Macron and and Germany, for example, German leadership, is stark. The fact that Olaf Scholz and his coalition cannot politically come together to match the sort of vision that Macron is coming up with, I think has been a key weakness on the European side. And it's playing out as you have these various renegade powers like Hungary that want to go a different path too in the face of clear Russian aggression. So the challenges are stark for Europe. As I said, there's a reckoning that is in the process of playing out on this side of the Atlantic as well as in North America.
And those divisions, William, of Vladimir Putin, they're playing into his hands. That's what he is counting on, a divided Europe.
Absolutely. And we're seeing, daily almost revelations about the degree to which Russia is using all of this to expand its influence either through covert means or through its own version of soft power in Europe, trying to influence many of these politicians who are skeptical of standing up to Russia, to play into that doubt and to sow the seeds of discord in Europe. Absolutely.
Yeah, Kevin, at the Elysee Palace, one of the things that Macron has said that he does not rule out is sending troops to Ukraine. That's another point of contention within the EU.
Absolutely. And actually, yesterday I asked John Kirby of the National Security Council exactly to that point, that this was an area of disagreement with Emmanuel Macron, saying that it should be a possibility, that he was considering that, while President Biden has repeated over and over again that he would not be sending U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. And the response from John Kirby and from the White House has been that basically they accept and they acknowledge the fact that on that they don't agree, that Emmanuel Macron has his way of doing things, his strategy on how France is coming to the aid of Ukraine. They also insisted on the fact that France has been at the forefront of helping Ukraine, whether militarily or otherwise, and that they simply saw these things differently, and that the U.S., when I asked about the strategy of the broader strategy of Macron, which is this idea of not letting Vladimir Putin know exactly where the West's limits are, what they're willing or not willing to do, and his answer was that we have a different strategy, which is to be very clear about what we think on this topic. And he said that there were three main pillars of President Biden's position when it comes to Russia. One is telling him very clearly that we're reinforcing the eastern flank of NATO and that they're ready to defend that flank. Second is that they will continue to help Ukraine. And finally, that they don't want an escalation with Russia. They don't want World War III. That is the position of the Americans. And they say that simply these are two countries that are aligned on what matters the most, and that there are just simply some different strategies, and that is not really a point of contention. At least that is the public message.
Yeah, they don't want World War III, but we do have the most intense fighting Europe has seen since World War II. We're going to go back and look at the images taking place at the Arc de Triomphe.